Continue the conversation here tonight. Chief Justice Mogoeng and Justices Sisi, Khampepe and Chris Jafta have retired from the Constitutional Court this week. For more on the state of the country's highest court and the legacy the three justices leave behind, we're joined by Busani Mabunda, who is a former Black Lawyers Association president and former Constitutional Court judge, Johann Kriegler. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. So it feels somewhat like the end of an era, because for the past decade, these are the justices that many people would have seen preside over key cases that have come before the Constitutional Court. Busani, your own reflections, please.
Oh, I thought perhaps you would start with the judge because he was sitting in that particular court. But of course, it is an end of a particular era, and one thing for sure is that all the justices, the Chief Justice, Justice Sisi Khampepe and Justice Jafta, have done a very sterling performance during the tenure of their era in enhancing and uplifting and taking the jurisprudence of South Africa to the level at which it is.
Justice Kriegler, it's difficult to, almost reflect on the legacies of all of these three judges, because they each, have their own standing. But from the perspective of somebody who served on the bench before, is the approach to leave as much of a personal mark as possible?
Certainly, that's part of the ethics of the judiciary. You try to hide yourself, remove yourself as much from the exercise. It's about the law, it's not about yourself. It's about the litigants, not about yourself. It's certainly, in the case of all three of these judges who are now retiring, they have had a long, difficult, hard job of work, and I wish the three of them every happiness in retirement. They've deserved it. They've worked very hard at a very tough job for a long time.
Justice Kriegler, it's sometimes, I suppose, in 2021, almost difficult to remember, if one is not careful, exactly how difficult things really got for the Constitutional Court over the last decades. They really were put in the eye of the storm. Reflect on some of those significant cases and what you think made this particular court stand out in the midst of those storms.
Well, Kathy, let's start off by saying that the task of the Constitutional Court is slightly different from that of all other courts. The Constitutional Court represents the judiciary in the structure of the South African state. It, together with the executive, that's the president and the civil service and the army, and the legislature, that is the two houses of parliament, between those three pillars of state, they constitute the center of the power of this country that we live in. The Constitutional Court is the primary protector of the Constitution, the primary interpreter of the Constitution, and it stands in an uneasy balance with the other two pillars of state. They are in technical constitutional opposition. They should, however, ideally work in cooperation with one another, respect for one another, deference for one another's area of responsibility. In the last decade, the Constitutional Court has come under attack from senior members of the executive, senior members of the legislature that have at times, because they were unhappy with decisions of the Constitutional Court, saw fit to attack the integrity, the honor, the truthfulness of the Constitutional Court and its judges. That was regrettable. I think that the Constitutional Court has weathered those attacks. I remember full well an occasion when Chief Justice Mogoeng called a meeting of the three legs, the three pillars of state, where they thrashed out their differences. They had a frank discussion. It cleared the air and things improved. It was not the last time that disgruntled losers saw fit to criticize the Constitutional Court. And of course, in the last couple of months, we've seen the truly disgraceful scene of a former head of state, a former president, defying, insulting, challenging the integrity of the Constitutional Court. That made it extremely difficult for the judges to do their job. They did it, they stuck to it, they didn't necessarily always agree with one another, but by and large, broadly, they showed the country that they can be trusted between them to protect the Constitution and preserve the liberties and rights of all of us.
Busani, when one looks at the interviews that have been taking place at the JSC recently, there's no question over the fact that there's broad interest and even greater interest just from ordinary South Africans about the processes that go into electing judges, but also what is deemed a fully and a well-functioning court. And, you know, there have been some successes for the Constitutional Court, but some of the weaknesses, even along the administrative lines, have been highlighted in the kind of questioning that has been put to those that are being interviewed for the vacancies on the Constitutional Court. In your own perspective, as somebody who's been part of an association for black lawyers, what would you say are some of the weaknesses of the court that perhaps those who are coming in could immediately be looking at in strengthening the court?
Your question does not come out in a more structured way, because at first you were asking about the interview process, and then you are now talking about the judges as to what is it. Are you asking about the level of alertness with which and then they should come with when they enter into that particular court, having regard to the processes as they have unfolded in the JSC lately?
So, Busani, the point that I'm making is that in those questions, in those interviews at the JSC, what has come out have not just been the strengths of the court, but also the weaknesses. The question of the administration of the courts and how long it takes the courts to preside over, to make decisions over some matters, is an issue that all of these candidates that are being interviewed have had to answer to. So that's been perhaps something that has been noted by the commissioners of the JSC. So I'm asking you whether there are particular weaknesses that you believe the Constitutional Court has that perhaps the incoming justices would need to work on in order to strengthen the court.
You see, the administrative powers, as well as the issue with respect to the functionality and efficiency of the court, the administrative head is the Chief Justice. So the machinery with respect to that functionality has to be seen in that particular level, insofar as it relates to the issue of expedition. Because one thing certainly is that there hasn't been much of a delay to talk about in terms of handing over of judgments through the Constitutional Court. But from an efficiency point of view and an administrative point of view, is for the next head of state to make it a point that they look into that particular factor for expedition purposes, as well as access to justice, especially for the poor and vulnerable who do not have the means for the purpose of access to that particular court.
Justice Kriegler, in your own view, are there weaknesses that the Constitutional Court needs to try and strengthen going forward?
I certainly have views, but I don't have views that I think it would be proper for me to publish at the moment. Thank you. I don't want to be seen to be criticizing any court in the country. They are human beings. They make mistakes like all other human beings. They correct their mistakes. I have confidence in the body as a whole.
And you know, what you're saying is important because in many ways, judges in this country seem to have been elevated to a level of perhaps being beyond human beings, beyond making mistakes. What is the appropriate way? Is there an appropriate way, perhaps, is even the place to begin, of criticizing the work that is being done by judicial officers without necessarily being seen as attacking their credibility or even attacking the authority of the courts?
Kathy, you're perfectly correct. It is the right of every citizen in the country to criticize the courts and the work they do. It's their courts. The courts are not a royalty sitting on a pedestal somewhere. They serve the people. But you should not challenge, question the integrity of the court just because you don't like its results. In my case, however, I'm not an ordinary citizen. I'm a former judge of that court, and I don't think it would be proper for me to express my views about shortcomings or mistakes in public. I speak privately to my colleagues on the Constitutional Court. I have done so in the past, and God willing, I'll continue to do so.
Fair enough. Justice Johann Kriegler, let me thank you for your time, and Busani Mabunda, who is the former Black Lawyers Association president.